So I sort of don't even know how to introduce this first story today, except I guess to just start with the facts. A photographer caught a picture of Donald Trump's handwritten notes that he had made right after he finished giving just a completely off the rails, unhinged press conference on Monday. And in the handwritten notes, which were photographed, Trump had the terrorist group Al Qaeda written as Alcaida, all one word, more like a superfood berry of some kind than the terrorist group. And right away, when the world expressed concern that the guy is clueless, the usual defenders came out of the woodwork and said, listen, just because you can't spell doesn't mean you can't think. He could be incorrectly spelling really good ideas. It's ableist to criticize the fact that he seems unable to spell, which is sort of extra funny because when you hear from people who seem to have no concern about disabled rights start to say you're being mean to Trump in an ableist way because the guy can't spell, that's weird. And it's also weird because it implies that Trump has some kind of cognitive disability, which those same people have to date denied is the case. But this has become popular recently. I saw some people recently explaining or attempting to explain, when you go online and someone says your instead of you apostrophe re, it's totally irrelevant whether they spelled something correctly or whether they used the right version of your or your. They might just process information differently. They could still have really good ideas. These are still people who we should be turning to when it comes to political ideas and how the country should be organized or whatever. There's no connection between their spelling and grammar and anything else. The thing is, this is not the case for Donald Trump, okay? There are certainly people that we could identify and say, hey, you know what? They have dyslexia, and here's how this is reflected, but it really doesn't seem to influence their ability to think. It's no indication of the fact that they are limited or ignorant or whatever else. This is not some mere isolated spelling mistake with Donald Trump. The press conference itself was off the rails. The ideas that Trump espouses are off the rails. He has demonstrated himself to be ignorant to foreign and domestic policy and economic policy and so many other things. And it turns out that he also doesn't seem to know that Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda, is not spelled Alcaida. This is red alert insanity for a president of the United States. Now, I thought it was actually a joke when I saw this. I thought that this was some kind of Photoshop thing. I truly didn't believe that Donald Trump had written down what looks like Al-Qaeda on a piece of paper as his notes, but it is real. And this is the press conference in which Donald Trump said that four ethnically minority congresswomen should go back to where they originally came from, their original countries, for which he was ridiculed worldwide. And this is all made much worse when you realize that Donald Trump's absurd and erratic comments weren't actually off the cuff. We often say Trump should really stick to his notes or the script or the teleprompter that he criticized Barack Obama for using, but now relies on himself. Because if he strays from it, if he goes off the cuff, he goes off the rails. He had these ideas in his notes, not only Al-Qaeda, but also stuff about these people and socialism and whatever else. And I hate to bring this up again, only because it's so upsetting to imagine that this is what's going on. Obviously, this is renewing fears and concerns about dementia or cognitive decline in Donald Trump. Yeah, Trump might just be a bad speller in addition to being completely ignorant and narcissistic and xenophobic and racist and a sexual predator. But once again, we do have to confront the possibility that there's cognitive decline here. And every new glimpse we get into the mind of Donald Trump is only increasing the concerns that this is more than just a guy who can't spell and has bad ideas. This is a story about winning the birth lottery, okay? Trump is a guy who, if he were not the son of a millionaire who gave Trump a small loan of $1 million to start a real estate business, would be the guy ranting about Jesus on the subway platform, okay? Were it not for being the CEO his entire life, like if Trump actually had to work somewhere like a normal employee, his personality combined with his ignorance would make him unable to hold a job. In any other country, by the way, Trump would only be a billionaire real estate dude. He would not have become president of the United States. Here in the United States, we have the sort of special privilege, as some might call it, and I'm using that term sarcastically, we have the special privilege of having 60 million people who thought this was a good idea when they voted back in November of 2016, or at least a better idea than Hillary Clinton. So this is a combination. This is a rare combination that we have of someone who, to go back to the beginning of the story, yes, can't spell, and is a narcissist, xenophobic, ignorant, whatever, who also only even had the possibility of running for president because of winning the birth lottery in the United States, and had the benefit of tens of millions of ignorant people in the United States who thought it was a good idea to vote for him. It really takes, we talk about the multiverse theories, multiverse hypotheses about you can imagine that there are an infinite number of additional universes in which everything is possible, where you are king of the United States and whatever else. We seem to be in one of those wacky scenarios where the stars have aligned, so to speak, and Donald Trump has been able to become president of the United States. And it's bad. I'm glad that foreign leaders are finally saying the extent to which it's bad, and they recognize it's bad. Now we just have to make the right decision in November of 2020. So continuing to do not as he says he will do, Donald Trump's 2019 deficit is on track to reach the $1 trillion mark, despite Trump having told us, you might remember, time and time and time again, that he's going to fix the deficit that Barack Obama ruined, that he will pay off the debt altogether if given 8 years in office and the time that he thinks he will need to do it. Now, anyone who understands these issues, even remotely, knew that it was never going to happen. And in fact, it's getting worse and worse. As I've said before, though, we really need to be reframing our conversations about this issue of debt and deficit altogether. So let's start with the facts, and then we'll get into the analysis and the sort of meaning of all of this. The White House itself is now predicting that the deficit is going to exceed $1 trillion this year. The deficit has never hit $1 trillion in a year. Now, anytime we talk about these numbers, this is not partisan. This is not to make this worse or not as bad as it is. This is just understanding. When we hear the deficit has never reached X number of dollars before, we need to understand, number one, inflation-adjusted numbers so that we're really comparing apples to apples. It's also important to understand the size of the deficit as a percentage of the economy's total size and not in a vacuum. Just a few things if we really want to do this seriously. Now, let's go back to what Donald Trump said that he would do. When Trump was a candidate, he said, number one, he would eliminate the deficit altogether and he would get us a surplus. Partially, he would do it by cutting taxes for the rich and corporations, which he said would generate so much growth that government tax revenues would actually expand, and there would be all this winning, and we would have a surplus, and we would start paying off the debt. That obviously never happened. And it's important to understand, like, if you want to talk about this at all, I hate that I have to do this, but you really need to understand the difference between debt and deficit, okay? And I apologize to those who are sick of me doing this, but when I don't do this, and even sometimes when I do this, the comments that I get in reaction to debt and deficit stories are so confused about the difference between the two terms. So these are not the same things. Deficit is the 1 year surplus versus deficit that the country may have. Debt is the accumulated deficits and surpluses over time. So let me give you an example. If in year one of a country, you run a $50 deficit, at the end of that year, the country has accrued a debt of $50. You exist for 1 year, you ran a $50 deficit, your debt is now $50. If in the next year you run a $25 surplus, what happens at the end of that year is your debt has gone down from $50 to $25, right? Year one deficit is $50. Year two surplus is $25. At the end of year two, the accumulated debt is $25. You went $50 negative after year one, and you paid off 25 of it with your surplus in year two. Okay. I mean, I apologize. Some people write in and they say, David, please stop talking to the audience like they're little kids. That's not what I'm trying to do. Every time I do this, people are confused about the two issues. So we were told that the tax cuts would pay for themselves because they would generate massive growth and they would move us from having a deficit each year to having a surplus, which would start chipping away at the national debt. Eventually, if Trump has 8 years in office, completely paying off the national debt. Now, none of that stuff is happening, okay? The tax cuts have added to the deficit. Increases in defense spending, which, by the way, were favored not only by Republicans, but even by many Democrats as well. Those are increasing the deficit. And we are not on track. We're not on track to even pay off any of the debt, never mind pay it off completely in 8 years. So those are the facts. Now, I do think every time we talk about this, we should consider whether it needs to be reframed. And what I mean by that is the debt and deficit is a political football, okay? Republicans say the most important thing is paying off the debt and balancing the budget. When there's a Democrat in the White House, regardless of whether that Democrat has actually slowed down deficit growth, which Barack Obama did, when Republicans are running, they run on promises to do this really important thing, start paying off debt, generate a surplus. But then when they are in office, as we saw under George W. Bush, as we're seeing in a cartoonishly exaggerated fashion under Donald Trump, they just explode the deficit. And they always claim that they're doing it. They either deny that they're doing it, even though we have the numbers and that's what we see, or they will argue that there were extenuating circumstances whereby it made sense to deficit spend. Like, for example, when we decided we were going to heroically spread democracy to Iraq and or punish Iraq for their non-existent involvement in 9/11, right? The reason it made sense to spend all that money in Iraq changed once we figured out Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but still we were given reasons why it made sense. So what we have today, in the end, is an unsurprising status quo. We were told before Trump was elected what he wants to do with tax policy is not going to generate all of this winning and growth and start paying off the debt with surpluses. In fact, it's going to increase the deficit. That is exactly what happened. None of this is surprising. So that gets us to the question of if and how Democrats should talk about this on the campaign trail. Because on the one hand, Trump made promises and he broke the promises and he's doing the opposite of what he promised to do. It seems as though exposing that on the campaign trail for the eventual Democratic nominee would be a worthwhile thing. But on the other hand, we know, number one, that it's just a political football. We know, number two, that in reality, the narrative over deficit bad, surplus good, cutting spending good, or whatever else, it's not actually a modern and nuanced understanding of debt and deficit. What we should be asking in reality is, when does it make sense for governments to deficit spend? And when doesn't it make sense? So, do we want a deficit spend to line the bank accounts of the already rich and corporations, including just providing money for them to buy back stock? The answer is no. Do we want to deficit spend to improve society for large numbers of people, improve their ability to live good, healthy lives, have access to health care, work jobs that they like without being tied to mediocre health insurance programs? Okay, now we have something to talk about. So I think that it is important for Democrats not to ignore the issue of debt and deficit, but we can't allow the right to continue framing the narrative because they win. They talk about it one way when it's a Democrat in office. They take office. Then they just say, oh, no, the numbers aren't actually what they are. You can't believe the numbers that we're actually getting from the Congressional Budget Office and from the Treasury. They win with the framing that we have. And lastly, please, 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 can we stop falling for this stupid idea that tax cuts for the rich are so good for the economy that they reduce the deficit and actually increase government revenue? We didn't even need another example. We had plenty of examples before Donald Trump's tax reform plan, but we can now add the Trump tax reform plan to the list of tax cuts for the rich and corporations that did not cause so much growth that they paid for themselves. My question to you is, do you think Republicans even believe this idea that tax cuts for the rich pay for themselves? Or do they know that it's BS, but just keep repeating it because these are the tax cuts that they want? That's my question to you today. Let me know what you think. This next story is one of the funniest things that has ever happened on this show. I believe that I have caught extremist right-winger and Proud Boy founder Gavin McInnes calling into the show pretending to be someone else in order to promote his new program. Last week, I got a call during live calls from a guy who said, hey, my name is Jim. David, have you heard about Gavin McInnes' new show? He interviews left-wingers. You should go on his show. You should own him. And I didn't really think much of it. The caller said he had a subscription to Gavin McInnes' show. And then after watching all of the videos, he canceled it. And because I'm in the media space and I've heard of Gavin McInnes' new show, it didn't sound obviously weird to me. But after the fact, I started thinking, the truth is nobody's really heard of Gavin McInnes' new show, especially people on the left. It is sort of weird to imagine that a left winger is going to go and pay for a subscription to Gavin McInnes' show. And over the weekend, a bunch of people on our subreddit started posting that, hey, David, that sounded a lot like Gavin himself who called you, a sort of mild Canadian accent. That was Gavin. And is David playing along or is David not realizing it? So I sent it over to my manager, who knows about this show. And he said, yeah, it does sound a lot like Gavin McInnes. I've gone back and listened to the call again. And I believe that this is Gavin McInnes. And this is hilarious for a few different reasons. But first, let's listen to part of the call just so everybody knows what I'm talking about. Okay, let's go next to our caller from the 253 area code. Who's calling today from 253?
Hey, David, it's Jim. And I just wanted to say, long-time listener, first-time caller, love you. And I just wanted to talk about the Green New Deal and just see what ideas you had about maybe getting that pushed through. And also, a guy I despise came up on my YouTube the other day on a commercial, Gavin McInnes, on this new show, Free Speech. And I was trying to click out of it right away. And then all of a sudden I saw Dr. Cornel West and Mark Lamont Hill on the show.
Yeah.
And I actually checked it out, and it's a cool show in regards to just liberals nailing Gavin, and it was so awesome to watch, especially Mark Lamont Hill. I canceled my subscription because I saw all the shows, but I just thought it'd be awesome if you could get on his show and destroy him for us.
So hold
please.
on, you canceled your subscription to what?
Oh, I signed up just to watch the Dr. Lamont Hill
I see.
and Cornel West show on the Free Speech.
So clearly the caller is someone who's very comfortable on calls like this. That's not really evidence that it's Gavin McInnes. He does seem to know a little bit too much about Gavin McInnes' new show, despite the fact that no leftist has even mentioned this program to me ever, and no leftist really seems to be aware of this program. He claims that he subscribed to it just to see an interview with Mark Lamont Hill, which is sort of hard to believe that that's what somebody would do. And then I went and listened to other interviews with Gavin, and it sounds like this is Gavin McInnes. There's a slight Canadian accent when you listen to the pronunciation of some words. The real Gavin is Canadian. I actually was able to get in touch with former personal friends of Gavin McInnes's and said, just tell me what you think. As the caller Gavin, they all said, I've had many phone conversations with Gavin, 99.9%. That is Gavin McInnes. The name Jim that was used matches another data point that I was able to find related to people associated with Gavin McInnes. I don't know how else to kind of say that part. We also backtracked the phone number that this individual called from. The phone number, again, matches a known location for where Gavin McInnes lived for a long time. So basically, I believe there is a 99.9% chance that Gavin McInnes is personally calling other programs and under the name Jim. Reminds me of what was Trump's fake guy, Daniel Miller, or so Trump had some name he used to call when he would call other places about himself. And there's a few takeaways. Number one, Gavin McInnes truly seems so desperate to get attention for his show that he's sitting around calling shows like mine when I open the phone lines to mention his own show. That's pathetic. Now, second, why not have someone else call? Like, it would be hilarious if 100 people from my audience started calling conservative shows and mentioning the David Pakman show. That would actually be really funny. It would annoy the right-wing hosts. I would get those clips. I would play them. But me just calling a show and mentioning my own name, that's a lot less funny and interesting. But it also goes to show, because I'm totally clueless and I wouldn't even recognize Gavin's voice, I actually thought maybe there is some left-winger in my audience who actually signed up and paid for Gavin McInnes' show to watch Mark Lamont Hill, which upon any amount of inspection doesn't sound right at all. Now, here's the situation that's going on behind the scenes. This is not random. What's going on behind the scenes is that Gavin McInnes' program, I don't know where they get the money, but they are offering to pay guests to come on. Now, this is not typically done. We have never paid a guest. We've had, 1,500 interviews that I've done. We've had 2 or 3 people ask for money. We've never paid. We just never pay for guests. Every time I appear on CNN, Fox News, I'm never paid for those appearances, okay? The Gavin McInnes program is apparently so desperate to get people to appear on this program that they reached out to me through my manager and offered, I'm not going to say how much, but a lot of money for me to appear on the program. So what took place here was not random promotion. What appears that happened is that, knowing that there is a conversation taking place with my manager about will David Pakman appear with Gavin McInnes, Gavin thought, hey, here's an idea. I'll call David as Jim and pretend to be a leftist who really wants to see David appear on Gavin McInnes' show. This is absolutely nuts that this is going on. There are other progressive hosts who I won't name because I don't know if they're going public with it, who have also been approached by this program and offered money to appear. And my manager had the hilarious idea of, if the number isn't spoofed, like if I could actually call the number back and speak to Gavin, say, hey, Jim, you called me on the David Pakman show. I just wanted to tell you, I actually am thinking of appearing on that show. Just kidding. Gavin, this is you, right? Why'd you call me? Why'd you call me live on the air? Let me know what you think. Absolutely stunning, bizarre, and outrageous that this is what's going on. But this is where things are apparently for Gavin McInnes at this point in time. Okay, this next story is so damn funny that it's actually difficult for me to put into words. Marianne Williamson is running for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination. She has no chance. I mean, she's polling so low that she's not even in the top 20 candidates in recent polling summaries. Now, she's a little bit wacky. She has a long history of being a sort of new age self-help guru. I've interviewed her on the program before, but she also has lots of completely reasonable and mainstream left-wing views, which I agree with, and many of the people in our audience would agree with. There is also a cultural critic and arbiter of big ideas named Dave Rubin, who is all about discussing ideas, and he's like a sort of center-right kind of guy. And he interviewed Marianne Williamson, and she truly made him look so uninformed and did it so easily, like without even breaking a sweat, with no visible effort, debunking all of Dave Rubin's attempts to put her in some sort of corner. And it was really a pleasure to watch. So I want to look at a couple of these with you. One popular sort of meme or false notion that the right has been pushing is that we should be giving Donald Trump credit because he decided not to bomb Iran. And it's such a dumb talking point, because if it ignores the reality that Trump is the one who made the decision to bomb Iran in the first place, and then he erratically canceled it last minute after someone said, hey, 150 people are likely to die because of this, right? And Bernie Sanders had a really good analogy on this when he was asked, shouldn't Trump get credit for not bombing Iran? Bernie said, this is like if you set a trash can on fire and then you put the fire out and you say, hey, everybody, I did a great thing. I put the trash can fire out. It's like, well, you set the fire in the first place. So what kind of credit do you really deserve for that? So Marianne Williamson destroys this talking point easily, points out that Trump is pulling us from the nuclear deal, that Trump's pulling us from the nuclear deal, better said, was the real problem.
I know you wouldn't want to give it to him, but does Trump deserve some credit for not doing that strike? If he got a call a minute before, and 120 people are going to get killed.
Credit for. Yeah. In terms of Iran, no, it was the president who recklessly removed us from the Iran nuclear deal. That is what led up to that. The president taking us out of the Iran nuclear deal, out of a situation that was an international leveraging, where by all indicators, Iran was, that we know of, Iran was complying. So now they've said the other day that they're going to go on and enrich uranium beyond what the agreement called for because we had pulled out. No, I cannot give the president any credit for what's happening with Iran. The fact that he was about to do something so unbelievably reckless. Because let me tell you something, given the size of the Iranian army alone, you think Iraq was a catastrophe? Nothing compared to what war with Iran would look like. So obviously some hero, we don't know exactly who it was, but we know someone within the higher echelons of either his administration, his national security apparatus, or the military talked him out of it. That we can be very thankful to this person, whoever they were.
This is really fun, I have to admit. I love watching these clips. It's just so funny to watch the breakdown, because you've got kooky Marianne Williamson just easily exposing the absurdity of these questions from Dave Rubin. So here's another one. Another one of these ideas that's sort of being pushed on Democrats is the idea that the Democratic 2020 presidential candidates are for open borders. And of course, not a single Democrat has said anything about open borders. And this is so funny because when Marianne Williamson points it out, Dave Rubin says, well, okay, they're not saying they're for open borders, but it sort of seems like that's what their policies are all about. And Marianne Williamson is just having none of it.
Okay, a couple more quick. We'll try to do them quick. It seems like everyone's kind of veering to some version of open borders. That's somehow something kind of.
No, you
so
say
tell
you're
me.
a Democrat. Where do you get this?
Well, I don't consider.
You say I'm a Democrat.
No, I don't consider myself a Democrat anymore.
I
don't consider myself a Republican, but I'm definitely not a Democrat.
I have not heard one candidate.
Well, they won't say it, but the policies seem to be.
Oh, you don't say it, but you really. I mean, is that healthy, honorable debate?
Of course, no one has said anything about open borders policies. And this is actually what they say we're not supposed to do when it comes to saying people are racist, except here, it's really a cut and dry policy thing. So let me explain what I mean by that. The right loves to say, even if someone says something that sounds racially insensitive, or it could be xenophobic or racist, you don't really know what's in their mind, so you can't call them racist. You don't know their true motivations for saying that thing that might sound racist, so you shouldn't call them racist. Here, Dave Rubin is saying, okay, even though no one has actually said they want open borders, it's okay to infer that they are for open borders, apparently because, what, they're against caging kids at the border? They're against deporting DACA recipients who were brought to the United States by their parents through no fault of their own when they were minors. And then lastly, Dave Rubin tries to, I guess, call out Marianne Williamson for making an analogy between the Holocaust and slavery in the United States as horrible, horrible events, which is funny because the right claims to be against the Oppression Olympics. This is one of their big things. The right says, you know, I'm against ranking oppressive events. I'm against ranking what demographic group is more or less oppressed or deserving of help in society. Okay, fine. But here is Marianne Williamson, who seems to have to explain that to Dave Rubin.
Well, do you think there's a little bit of a risk in sort of, I mean, a couple of times you're referencing the genocide of the Jews to slavery. Seems like a little bit of a slippery slope there, no?
I don't even know how we can say that, actually, and I say that as a Jew. Have you read up much on slavery?
Yeah.
We're talking abject slavery, Dave. I mean, nobody's in a contest. Nobody has a monopoly on human suffering. This was abject slavery.
There's always a risk to equating civil rights catastrophes because it's true. There's no two events that are exactly the same. Events take place in different places and at different times in history. So to say two events are the same or basically the same or mean the same thing, it's a little bit risky. But American slavery was one of the worst things that's happened. And the Holocaust is one of the worst things that has happened in human history on this planet. So this may have been like the best possible thing to ever happen to Marianne Williamson's campaign. She's still polling at 0. It doesn't even seem like that many people have seen this interview. But it was really a pleasure to watch. And I got some emails after the last debate. This is really weird. After the Democratic debate a few weeks ago, I got some emails from people saying, hey, David, I think Marianne Williamson actually did the best in the debate. I think Marianne won the debate. Here's links to some YouTubers who agree with me. And I was certain it had to be some kind of satirical thing, like back when Howard Stern's audience was trying to vote for Sanjaya, a candidate on American Idol, even though the kid couldn't sing, just because it would be funny to support someone who has no idea what's going on. But apparently it was real. And a lot of people actually seem to be claiming that in some kind of serious way, Marianne Williamson won that first debate. She holds some of the right positions on a number of issues, but she is quite out there and certainly not somebody I could see getting behind, given the other people that are in the 2020 Democratic slate of possibilities. Let me know what you think. Make sure you're following me on Instagram at david.pakman. And while you're there, follow the David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Right back after this. Many of you are not going to believe what I'm going to tell you today unless you've actually been following the story, in which case you will absolutely believe it. YouTube demonetized 75% of our video clips that we uploaded yesterday from yesterday's program. Yesterday's show that we did for you, which we spent all day producing, of course, and filming and editing and all of that stuff, contained 8 separate clips that we uploaded to YouTube. And upon uploading them, 6 of the 8, or 75%, were instantly demonetized by YouTube's algorithm. 75% of the work we did yesterday, the content that we spent all day producing, was in a fraction of a second deemed not advertisers friendly and thus unable to earn any revenue for us on YouTube. So I want to be really clear here about what I am saying and about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we have a legal issue on our hands here. Let me be clear. I'm not saying YouTube can't choose to monetize or not to monetize whatever they want. But let me also be clear that we're playing by the rules. And this is not how the system is supposed to work. We don't do profanity on our channel. We don't do violent and gory images. We don't harass people on the basis of their sexual orientation or other characteristics. We don't bully people. We don't dox people or anything like that. We produce FCC safe, progressive news and commentary. And while we're supposedly playing by all of YouTube's rules, more and more of our content is being demonetized. So yesterday, we produced the show, we paid salaries to our staff, we paid studio rent, we paid utilities, we paid connectivity, we paid health insurance, but the clips, 75% of them, make no money on YouTube. Hundreds of thousands of views yesterday from these clips that make no money on YouTube. So this is a systemic issue. And notice, I don't want to be misquoted. There are articles that now there are media outlets following my coverage of what's going on YouTube, and they have started to misquote what I am saying. I am not saying we are being demonetized for being left-wing or progressive, okay? The right has preached sob stories for years about the anti-right-wing bias on YouTube and everywhere else. I am not saying this is anti-left-wing bias. The evidence that I found is that this is anti-independent bias and pro-corporate bias within the news and politics space on YouTube. So I think I just have to kind of get real with you here about the situation. I had to reach out to our partners this week and basically say, this may never be resolved, okay? This may simply be the new normal, and we need to kind of reposition our expectations around the reality that this may never be fixed because, again, I don't think YouTube believes anything is broken. I don't believe YouTube thinks there is anything to fix here. This is the system they want because it's safe for them because their advertisers like it. There's also what appears to be a growing issue of people being unsubscribed from our channel and others that are independent news and politics. And I am seeing this in the analytics. I've received hundreds of emails from people who say, David, I've been a subscriber for a month. I've been a subscriber for a year. I've been a subscriber for 5 years to your YouTube channel. I went to your channel today because I didn't notice any of your videos on my homepage. And I noticed that the subscribe button was enabled, meaning I was able to click subscribe because I had somehow been unsubscribed from your channel. Now, I know a lot of people are going to hear me say this and they'll email me and say, David, this is happening to me as well. I've already told YouTube about it. I've told them about it 10 times. All I can say is make sure you're subscribed right now. I mean, check right now if you're watching on YouTube and click the subscribe button if you aren't. If you're listening on the radio or to the podcast or whatever, consider going to YouTube and subscribing to our channel there as well. So I'm exploring many other options to try to deal with this issue that we're experiencing. The most direct is not, moving our content to some platform with no audience. Sadly, I know people email me. They say, David, start uploading to X, Y, or Z website. Moving our content to websites where the content isn't monetized and there's nobody watching is not a solution to the problem, okay? So what's important to understand is if we didn't have any other revenue sources, we might be in a position to have to change our story choices in order to save our revenue. And what I mean by that is if we didn't have revenue coming in through membership or through Patreon, I might have to start each day thinking, okay, here's the 6 stories I want to do, but 4 of those are likely not to make any money on YouTube. I guess I'll pick some different stories. I would never want to do that. That is the death of independent media. The whole point here is we cover what we believe to be important. And this is how these monetization algorithms set the agenda and drive the narrative by making certain content financially unsustainable. So that's the freedom that we get when people support us directly. And as more and more people contribute via direct membership and Patreon, you are basically buying us a little sliver of immunity from having to even think about making decisions like, here's the stories I want to cover, but they're not going to make any money. Maybe I'll pick some stories that YouTube's algorithm would find to be brand safe. I can't afford to spend all day researching and filming and editing and having our staff do that and pay salaries and health insurance and rent only to lose out on the monetization. So as I've said it before, I'll say it again. The way to fix this is simply to fund the shows you like directly, okay? Become a member, www.joinpakman.com. It's really cheap. It's really quick. You get cool stuff, but you buy us immunity from this disastrous situation that's taking place. There is a discount code for membership. This is 2020, which will save you 40%. If you want to do something else, you can go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, especially if you already are giving to other producers on Patreon. Throw us $1 a month. Throw us $2 a month. It really does make a difference. Patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I don't even really know how to start today other than to tell you that it's okay to say that Donald Trump is racist. That's really something we need to talk about today. It has to be discussed in order to take power back from the right on this issue, because the right has waged a really effective war against saying people are racist. They've done this for years, actually. And the reason is clear. There's a ton of racism on the right, explicit and implicit. If they can stigmatize the calling out of racism, the saying that someone is racist, they are mostly helping themselves. This doesn't mean racism and xenophobia don't exist on the left. I've talked about anti-Semitism on the left, but as a political strategy, this is something that disproportionately benefits the right. The being able to say, you're calling someone a racist, that's the problem. And they've used a few strategies in order to do this. One literally can't be refuted. When they say racism is what's deep in someone's mind or heart, and no matter what somebody says, you don't really know whether deep down they are racist in their hearts and minds. So you shouldn't call anyone a racist, because no matter what it seems as though they believe, you don't really know deep down in their heart of hearts what they believe. This is a joke because it's completely unfalsifiable. It's possible that someone is acting like a racist and saying racist things and suggesting racist policy, but that they're merely acting and that deep down, they don't actually believe any of those things. But that's the same way that you can't know for sure if someone is a narcissist from their media presence, because they could be acting. But think about Donald Trump. We have decades of Donald Trump's interviews and actions. If your argument is he's only been acting like a narcissist for 40 years, and we can't possibly know whether he actually is one, it's a really weak argument, because we could never really know one way or another. Even if we ask Trump, hey, listen, you've said and done all these things. It seems like you're a narcissist, but deep down, are you really? Whatever his answer is could also be a lie. So that is just a dead end path to really figure out whether someone is X, Y, or Z. But the more important thing is that when we're talking about public figures that dictate policy in particular, what matters is what they say and do publicly, in the sense that if I'm not personally racist, but I run a campaign on racist ideas and coalesce racist voters around me, and I have xenophobic and racist ideas about crime and IQ and cleanliness and whatever, what difference does it make if somewhere deep down in secret in my house at night, I'm not actually racist? My public persona is a racist one, and that is what is important. And media have fallen for this. Media are often afraid to call people racists or xenophobes, because Republicans have really successfully run this campaign of criticizing those who spot racism and xenophobia. Now, another strategy is they say, well, you're actually the racist for seeing race in this issue. You are seeing race in what someone said when it didn't have to be that way. You must be the one who is racist. Identifying racism and calling it out is the real racism. This is the second strategy that the right has employed in order to try to insulate themselves from their racism and xenophobia. It's another failed, laughable argument. It's like the childish whoever smelt it dealt it thing about farting. I mean, literally saying if you believe there is racism and if you see race, you are the racist, is like in the sandbox or the playground saying whoever smelt it dealt it. It's silly and childish. And I can't believe that it actually passes as an argument in some political circles in the United States. So with that out of the way, let's now look at Donald Trump's record, because people saying, oh, his friends are black and he likes black pizza guy Herman Cain, or his daughter converted to Judaism. Let's look at Trump's public record of actions and statements. Remember, during the Central Park 5 case, Donald Trump believed that 5 black kids committed a rape that they didn't commit, and actually spent money for an ad claiming that the death penalty should be reinstated specifically for them. And Trump attacked them even after they had been exonerated. But meanwhile, he had no problem with the deal that his outgoing Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta struck with serial child sex assaulter Jeffrey Epstein. Donald Trump led the birther conspiracy, which questioned whether Barack Obama was truly born in the United States on the basis of supposed irregularities with his long-form birth certificate. This was a racist conspiracy theory furthered and fomented by racists. Donald Trump was at the head of the pack when it comes to that. Trump has been targeted by the Justice Department in the United States for racist housing practices against people of color at buildings that he owned or managed in New York City. Donald Trump attacked the judge who was presiding over a case involving Trump University, saying that because the judge is Mexican, and the judge had Mexican parents, because the judge is of Mexican descent, they can't possibly be impartial arbiters of Trump's case. Which is, of course, completely and absolutely outrageous. Trump has mocked the genocide of Native Americans in the United States. Donald Trump suggested that American-born members of Congress should go back to their, quote, original countries, which is extraordinarily racially tinged xenophobic language and sentiment. Trump referred to poor countries with high non-white populations as, I guess we can say it now, but I won't, just to not get any of our stations in trouble, S-hole countries. This includes Haiti, El Salvador, and African countries. Trump once said immigrants from Haiti all, quote, have AIDS, and that Nigerian immigrants would, quote, never go back to their huts. So listen, is there ever going to be anything Trump does that will convince a racism denier that Trump is racist? There isn't. If something walks like a duck, though, and it talks like a duck, and it smells like a duck, it's probably a duck, and that's exactly what we have here. Now, again, some will hear me say this, and they'll say, David, you're inferring Trump's racism. You don't really know what's in his mind. You can't read his mind and know what's in there. Well, generally, people say what's on their minds. When they don't, they usually say things that make them look better than what's in their minds, not drastically worse. So we just can't be afraid to call things what they are, especially when world leaders around the world are not holding back anymore. Nancy Pelosi called it xenophobic. British politician David Lammy called it 1950s racism from the White House. Check out his tweet. Quote, Donald Trump telling 4 ethnic minority American congresswomen to go back where they originally came from. 1950s racism straight from the White House. Any British politician fit to serve as prime minister would condemn. Boris Johnson, will you? Getting into internal British politics. As I told you yesterday, British Prime Minister Theresa May called it, quote, completely unacceptable. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, tweeted, quote, the President of the United States telling elected politicians, or any other Americans for that matter, to go back to other countries is not okay, and diplomatic politeness should not stop us saying so loudly and clearly. London Mayor Sadiq Khan said on a radio show in the last couple of days, quote, I've heard it from racists and fascists, never from a mainstream politician. Here you have the president of the USA using that same sort of language. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has also denounced Donald Trump's comments, saying, quote, I think Canadians and indeed people around the world know exactly what I think of those comments. This is not how we do things in Canada. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And lastly, Belgian politician Guy Verhofstadt said, quote, Trump's racism is sickening. So they're calling this for what it is. We can also call it for what it is. But, and here is the important but, and this is what is not maybe being discussed as much as it should. You need to understand when you call this what it is, that this may be no accident, but actually part of the Trump-Pence reelection plan. And we should just understand that fully. I'm not saying don't call racism racism. I'm just saying, let's understand the full scope of what's going on here. Heather Parton, also known as Digby, wrote a really good piece in Salon. And she says this is a strategy that the Republican Party of 2019 actually believes will get Donald Trump and Mike Pence reelected. And it may, because there is this bigger environment of pro-white, pro-Christian nationalism that is all part of what, even if the details sound bad, right? Caging kids sounds bad. Telling Americans to go back to their original countries, to some people, that sounds bad. It's painting a very favorable right-wing nationalist picture of the Trump administration meant to get him reelected. So put it all together, right? Refugee camps at the border, which we would condemn as a country if they were happening elsewhere. Red meat xenophobia on Twitter against mostly American-born members of Congress who happen to be ethnic minorities. Stoking fears of violent criminal aliens while undocumented immigrants, we know, commit crime at lower rates than American-born citizens. Mike Pence showing up at border detention centers and looking as the unempathetic, indifferent lunatic that he is. Trump announcing that ICE raids are going to start, quote, rounding up alleged criminals who simply haven't been caught yet. We're on the left. So we see this and we imagine, oh, if people simply find out that this is what they're saying and doing, they're not going to vote for him. That's not how it works. We're on the left. We don't understand how a lot of these right-wingers see this stuff. This is a package of so-called being tough on immigration, the tweets, the child cages. All of this stuff may well get Donald Trump reelected because the right absolutely loves the tough on immigration image. 2020 is going to be a mess. Partially, it's going to be a mess because of voter suppression. Partially, it's going to be a mess because of the seeding of doubt about whether any results that show Donald Trump losing can be trusted. That's already something Trump is ginning up. But it's also going to be a mess because Trumpists will be publicly voting for what we are seeing Trump do and say day in and day out, including the racism and the xenophobia. So the only path forward is removal with such overwhelming voter turnout that even the voter suppression and the Electoral College, which is stacked against the left, and the rampant, unhinged, xenophobic nationalists cannot get Trump reelected. And it's really simple how it works. If we can't do it, it's another 4 years of Trump. That is increasingly the way it's looking to me. I hate to say it, okay? We cannot convince them to change their minds. So the only way to get rational people to help us win this thing is to get non-voters who already agree with us to vote, okay? Everybody talks about this election will hinge on turnout. It will literally hinge on turnout. And I don't know how to get the turnout up. We're going to talk about that later in the week a little bit, but it's what has to be done. We don't have corporate media on our side. Yesterday, I told you that much of the Trump xenophobic go back to your original country stuff is meant to divide the left. The Trump Republican strategy is throw red meat at them, divide the left, make the eventual Democratic nominee toxic, meanwhile fire up his own base with xenophobic racist commentary. Corporate media is falling right in line with debates about the substance of Donald Trump's stupid tweets instead of the role that they are meant to play in influencing the discussion and, of course, keeping Trump scandals out of the news. So this is really bad. This is possibly as bad as it has been. And I hope that you'll understand what's going on. And that way you'll be working with us in trying to affect change in 2020. And just as importantly, in 2022, in which the Senate will actually be up for grabs for Democrats. It won't be in 2020. We need to be thinking about all of these things. But in order to do it, we need to understand exactly what it is that Donald Trump is doing with this commentary. And in the end, it's okay to call racism racist. We've just got to understand the role that it's playing in helping to get this guy reelected. Let me know what you think of the way this is all fitting together. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. Follow me on Twitter at @DPakman. And follow the show on Twitter at David Pakman Show.